Mr. Blumenthal. Brown. Mr. Brown. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Peters. Sir. Thank you. Passing. Thank you. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun. Thank you. Bozeman. Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Wyden, Rosen, Cruz, no. Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines. No? Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Inze, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, yes, sir. Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson. Thank you. Gotcha.
All right, so we'll let you know, but let us know.
Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Ms. Fisher?
No.
Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blumenthal, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Capito, Cardin, Casey, Collins, Coons, Cornyn, Cortez Masto, Kramer, Crapo, Ernst, Feinstein, Graham, Grassley, Hassan, Heinrich, Hirono, Hoven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Jones, Kane, King, McConnell, McSally, Menendez, Merkley, Moran, Murphy, Murray, Perdue, Peters, Portman, Reed, Rosen, Rounds, Schatz, Shaheen, Shelby, Sinema, Smith, Stabenow, Thune, Udall, Van Hollen, Whitehouse, Wicker, Wyden, and Young. Mr. Lankford? Ms. Baldwin? Aye. Senators voting. Ms. Murkowski? Aye. Senators voting in the negative: Bennett, Blackburn, Braun, Cassidy, Cotton, Cruz, Daines, Enzi, Fisher, Gardner, Hawley, Johnson, Kennedy, Klobuchar, Lankford, Lee, Manchin, Paul, Romney, Rubio, Scott of South Carolina, Tester, Tillis, and Toomey. Mrs. Gillibrand? Aye. I did. Mr. Durbin? Aye. Mr. Scott of Florida? No. Mr. Warner? Aye. Mr. Sullivan? Aye. Mr. Risch? No. Mr. Carper, no. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Sass, no. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Schumer. Aye. Mr. Leahy. Aye. And the bill is passed.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, the ayes are 67, the nays are 28, and the bill is passed. The senator from Texas.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes.
Without objection.
Madam President,
The senator
Madam President,
from
the
Texas.
Senate's not in order.
The Senate will be in order. The Senate will be in order. The senator from Texas.
Madam President, when the Senate gavels out at the end of this day, members will head home for the August work period to spend time with our constituents and family. I, for one, am eager to get back home to Texas and spend time with folks in about every region of my state. I have the honor of representing roughly 28 million people, and it takes a little bit of time and effort to get around the state, but I'm looking forward to it. I'll have the chance to highlight some of the work that we've been doing here in Washington, and yes, hear from my constituents, my fellow Texans, on what they care most about, what they agree with, what they disagree with, and everything in between. With the passage of this bipartisan budget deal, we've now taken care of our final piece of business for this work period. The funding agreement we just passed will provide stability for our nation through 2020 and deliver on some of the administration's key priorities. It's been the result of extensive negotiations between President Trump and Speaker Pelosi and represents a compromise between two sides that typically don't agree on much. And yes, compromise is still not a dirty word. It's the only way things get done around here. But obviously, this agreement is not perfect. That's the nature of compromise and the hallmark of responsible governing. By passing this funding agreement, we are avoiding the possibility of government shutdown again this fall. Instead, it provides us the time and space for wide-ranging debate about our government's spending habits. As our national deficit continues to grow, that could not be more critical. I was glad to see that through the President's tough negotiations, it prevents 30 poison pills or policy riders from reaching the President's desk. It's no secret that our friends across the aisle have tried their best to eliminate the Hyde Amendment, which since 1976 has defined a consensus that no taxpayer funds be provided for abortions. That argument is over until 2020. We also know there will be no Green Deal done, no undoing of the President's regulatory reform through the back door. Most importantly, though, this funding agreement invests in our military. If there is one priority for what we ought to be doing here as elected representatives in the federal government, is provide for the common defense and for our national security. This funding agreement provides the Pentagon the predictability and flexibility they need in order to keep our country safe today and tomorrow. A predictable and steady budget gives our military leaders the ability to plan for the future and it allows them to invest in the innovative and cutting-edge tools our service members need and ensure that when the call comes, we are ready. I was proud to support this funding agreement, and I'm glad it's now headed to the White House for the President's signature. Madam President, on another matter, over the last few months, I've spoken at length on the Senate floor about a bill I introduced earlier this year to reauthorize the Debbie Smith Act, legislation to help us end the nationwide rape kit backlog. This legislation carries the name of a fierce and courageous woman, a sexual assault survivor whose advocacy was born of her personal experience. 3 decades ago, Debbie Smith was abducted from her home and taken to a wooded area where she was robbed and raped by an unknown attacker. She reported the crime to police and went to the emergency room for a forensic exam. But because of the rape kit backlog, she had to wait 6.5 years before finally receiving the call that her attacker had been identified through a DNA test. During that time, she lived in constant fear, wondering who he was, where he was, and whether he would return to hurt her again. Identifying offenders through DNA evidence is critical to providing not only justice, but peace of mind for those assaulted, and delivering justice to victims, and yes, even exonerating the innocent. The power of DNA testing is such that it can essentially rule out people from being the potential, being the alleged assailant or the actual assailant. So this is really important for a number of reasons. And sharing this information across state lines through the federal system can help us identify repeat offenders who would otherwise go undetected. Knowing the potential impact, Debbie became one of our nation's most vocal advocates for eliminating rape kit backlogs, including this reprehensible rape kit backlog that I've been speaking about. In 2004, a bill that carries her name was signed into law to help local and state crime labs partner with federal law enforcement to receive resources to end the federal DNA evidence backlog. It is because of the Debbie Smith Act that more than $1 billion has been provided to forensic labs across the country. Since 2005, more than 860,000 DNA cases have been processed, accounting for 43% of all forensic profiles in the FBI's DNA database. The Debbie Smith Act has also been central in eliminating the rape kit backlog in my home state of Texas, which had reached the point of more than 20,000 untested kits at one point earlier this decade. As I said at the beginning, I introduced the Debbie Smith Act of 2019 to reauthorize this important funding stream that supports the auditing, testing, and sharing of DNA evidence so we can eliminate that backlog and ensure that it will not grow again in the future. The benefits of continuing the programs created under the original Debbie Smith Act cannot be overstated, and we must get this important legislation to the President's desk before it expires at the end of September. Since it was first enacted in 2004, the Debbie Smith Act has never lapsed or expired, and there's no excuse for allowing it to expire or lapse this year. This bill is not controversial, it's not partisan, and it's not divisive. In fact, when it came to the Senate floor, not a single senator voted against it. But since we passed the legislation in May, the House of Representatives has sat on its hands and has done nothing. After repeated requests from myself, our other colleagues, and countless victims advocates, Speaker Pelosi has refused to bring the Debbie Smith Act up for a vote. Earlier this year, the Fraternal Order of Police, which represents more than 348,000 members, sent a letter to Speaker Pelosi and Leader McCarthy urging the House to move this legislation. We also heard from the National District Attorneys Association, RAIN, the Sergeants Benevolent Association, and several other law enforcement and victims' rights groups who are fully supportive of this legislation. All of us are ready for the House to act. I urge Speaker Pelosi to take up the Debbie Smith Act once the House returns to Washington in September and before it expires or lapses. It is simply unconscionable to let unrelated partisan bickering stop a bill that brings justice to victims.
Madam President.
The senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Madam President. First, I want to compliment the leadership in being able to come together on a budget agreement. This was a good day for the United States Senate, good day for Congress, and good day for the American people. We now have predictable spending caps, not only for the fiscal year that begins October 1, but for the following year. So this is good news. It provides the predictability we need in order to have an orderly process for the consideration of the appropriation bills. When we return in September, it's our anticipation that the House and Senate Appropriations Committees will be hard at work, and we'll have an opportunity to get our work done prior to the beginning of the fiscal year on October 1. I want to just explain why I think this was the right vote and why I proudly supported it. It provides a reasonable growth rate for discretionary spending. If you look at the trend line over several decades, you will find that discretionary spending has become a smaller and smaller part of the federal budget. So we've held back on discretionary spending in this country, whether it's defense or non-defense needs. And those needs have grown, and we have not kept up with the needs of funding these programs. And this budget agreement will now give us the opportunity to set priorities and be able to move forward with many important programs that are funded by discretionary spending. Once again, discretionary spending has grown much slower than the growth rate of our budget generally. So it is a reasonable expectation that we can meet the needs of the people of this country by allowing some growth. So what does it mean? Well, this past week, the Environment and Public Works Committee has recommended a transportation reauthorization bill for surface transportation that would grow by about 10%. I think everyone in this chamber understands that we have tremendous unmet needs in transportation infrastructure in this country. These caps give us a better opportunity of meeting those types of needs. Tomorrow, I'll be in the city of Bowie, which is not far from here, meeting with the mayor, who has a simple request. His drinking water pipes need major maintenance or replacement. There is not enough capacity within the ratepayers in order to be able to do that work. He needs the federal partnership, the state revolving funds, or other areas in order to help fund a modern water infrastructure so that we have safe drinking water in our community. These budget caps, again, give us the opportunity to move forward on programs like that so the federal government can help us meet our needs. I'm proud in the state of Maryland, we have the National Institutes of Health that are located and headquartered in our state. We're all very proud of the work that they do. They're unlocking the mystery of diseases in this country. We need to fund them. At the present time, so many worthwhile grant applications go unmet and unfilled that could discover how we could deal with some of the most dreaded diseases in our country. Funding NIH is in our national interest, but we've been held back because of the budget caps that have been in place. This allows us now to move forward with that priority. This is the year that we prepare for the census. We only do that every 10 years, take the census of our country. This budget will allow the Census Bureau to have the tools so that we can accurately count the people in this country. Why is that important? It's in the Constitution, it's important, but it's important so that we do proper legislative representation in the congressional districts as well as in the state legislatures. That give us the numbers so that communities are properly represented so their voices can be adequately heard. It's also used for the distribution of federal funds so that proper distribution can be made to the people of this country. I could go on a whole list of issues that are important. Every one of them is important. We'll set the priorities, whether it's child care or dealing with our veterans. We all talk about how we want to make sure we do what's right for our veterans. We know that there are a lot of unmet needs. This budget will allow us to move forward in that area. I'm proud to represent the state of Maryland that has major urban centers. This bill will allow us to deal with some of the challenges that we have in our urban centers. I also represent rural Maryland. This bill will allow us to move forward with their needs. We'll be able to move forward in education, which is what should be our top priority. It's a great equalizer in this country. Now the appropriators will have to make those judgments on priorities, and we'll have to reconcile between the House and Senate and get the president's signature. But that's what we should be doing, setting up the priorities for our country, but having a reasonable pool of money to deal with discretionary spending. We've been denied that many years. Now we have the opportunity to really do what Congress should do and set the priorities for this country. In addition, we have one other area, let me just mention, is the drug problems. I probably have more meetings in my state on dealing with the drug crisis. It's in every community in Maryland and this nation, and I hope that we'll see increased federal participation in that area. Another part of the budget agreement was to extend the debt limit for 2 years. Now, Madam President, this to me is one of the absurdities of what we do on debt limits. We incur money, we incur debt, and then we put a limit as to whether we'll pay for the bills we incurred. You don't default on your debt. That's not what America's about. We got to control what we spend, but we have to pay for what we spend. And we have to honor our debt. So our credit ratings were at risk. The Secretary of Treasury made this one of his top priorities. I agreed with him on this issue. And now we no longer have the fear that America will not honor its debt. The bill also gets rid of sequestration. Good riddance. This was put in as a placeholder for us to deal with the budget deficit. It didn't work in that way. All it did was cause uncertainty, and in many respects would have required across-the-board cuts. That is not the way that we should do business. We have to make decisions. Sequestration could have been used for us to avoid making the tough decisions. We have to do that ourselves. So the bottom line is the budget agreement gets rid of that, gives us a much better chance to avoid a shutdown of government, which makes absolutely no sense at all, and hopefully not having to deal with continuing resolutions. Continuing resolutions put us on autopilot because we can't pass a budget. Now I hope we'll be able to pass budgets and avoid not only shutdowns but continuing resolutions. I want to emphasize this point. Discretionary spending has become a smaller part of the overall budget of this country. It's been a shrinking sum. So why do we have growing deficits? We have growing deficits because, and by the way, discretionary spending is at historically low levels in this country. Revenues, unfortunately, are also at historically low levels. In other words, we're not raising the traditional amount of revenue that is necessary for us to pay our bills. Now, I come from a family that believes you got to pay your bills. I think it's wrong for us to spend money today and ask our children and grandchildren to pay for our current spending. We should have the courage to provide the revenues necessary to pay our bills. But instead, what have we done? We've cut revenues again and again and again. So our deficit today is not sustainable. We have to deal with it. But the major culprit has been these irresponsible tax cuts, the last of which went primarily to the wealthiest people in this country. According to the Congressional Budget Office, will add $1.9 trillion to the deficit over the next decade. That's the culprit of the deficits, and that's what we should be dealing with. And I heard a lot of my colleagues come in here and lament this agreement saying it's going to add to the deficit. Some of those are the same people who voted for the tax cut. Let's be direct about this. We have to have the revenues necessary to pay for what we incur in spending. And yes, there's another area that we can do better, and that's in health care spending, much of which is mandatory spending. It's not discretionary spending. These are bills the appropriations that have to be made. And we can do a much better job in reining in the cost of health care. We had a chance to do that this week. And we didn't take full advantage of that. I'm a member of the Senate Finance Committee. We passed a bill to deal with the escalating cost of prescription drugs. Today in Maryland, I've been told 1 out of every 4 healthcare dollars is spent in medicines. So if we can, and we pay so much more in America for medicines than in the other industrial nations of the world. So yes, we have recommended to the Senate body a bill to deal with the cost of prescription medicines. It will deal with the issue of putting a cap on how much you can see escalation of current drug prices. It will put a cap on how much out-of-pocket costs the people in Medicare Part D will have to pay. That's good. They're two good things. But we had a chance to really make a difference by eliminating the prohibition in the current law that prevents Medicare from negotiating the cost of medicines. Think about that for one moment. Where else do we do that? Do we tell businesses that they can't leverage all their buying to get the lowest possible price? But we tell Medicare they can't leverage the total market that they're paying in order to get the best price on prescription medicines. What does that mean? That means we are overpaying. Whether you're paying it in Part D premiums, you're paying it in private insurance premiums, or you're paying as a taxpayer, we're paying too much for medicines. That's the primary reason why the international price on medicines is so much lower than what we pay here in America. And we had a chance to deal with it this week, and we didn't. We'll have another opportunity when the bill comes to the floor. And I hope we'll do the right thing by removing the prohibition that's in current law on negotiated price. So, Madam President, I am very pleased we got this budget agreement done. No, I'm not pleased about the deficit, but recognize the deficit. We need to deal with revenues, and we need to deal with costs like prescription drugs, which were not part of today's vote. So I hope when we return in September, the goodwill that we've used in order to get this budget agreement done will continue. The appropriators will be able to reconcile their appropriation bills before October 1, so we don't need continuing resolutions and there's no threat of a government shutdown. And then I hope we'll have the same type of bipartisan commitment where people have expressed their outrage on the growth of the deficit to deal with the real causes of the deficit. We'll have a chance on prescription medicines to deal with those costs, and let's have the courage to sit down and make sure we raise the revenues we need in order to pay for our expenses. With that, Madam President, I would yield the floor.
Madam President.
The Assistant Democratic Leader.
Madam President, today I rise on my behalf and behalf of Senator Tammy Duckworth to express my condolences to the family of Specialist Michael Isaiah Nance. He and fellow paratrooper Private First Class Brandon J. Kreischer of Ohio gave their lives in service to our country on July 29th in Uruzgan Province, Afghanistan. The early reports on their deaths are that they were shot by an Afghan soldier at a military base, a so-called green-on-blue attack, and the incident is under investigation. Isaiah was 24 years old. Isaiah was the 96th Illinois service member killed in Afghanistan since our invasion began in 2001, and one of 2,289 American troops who've died there since that invasion. He was a proud, outstanding member of the 82nd Airborne, earning the Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and the Combat Infantryman's Badge, as well as qualifying as a basic parachutist since enlisting in 2017. As a member of Nance's family noted, and I quote, "He loved his country and wanted to serve his country. He died doing something that he loved." Isaiah had arrived in Afghanistan just a few weeks ago, shortly after a trip to Europe with his mother, Sean Gregoire. He and thousands of other Americans still there were deployed in support of our NATO-led mission to train, advise, and assist the Afghan army known as Operation Freedom Sentinel. As fate would have it, when uniformed Army personnel arrived at his house to break this terrible news to his family, much of the family had already gathered after the funeral of Nance's great-grandfather, Sam Forrest Jr., who had served in the United States Army in the Korean War. As one member of Isaiah's family noted,
quote, "It was the worst day in our family's history." Isaiah was raised by his mother and grandparents in Chatham on the south side of Chicago. He attended college in Florida. After 2 years, he insisted to his mother that he wanted to join the Army. He wanted to continue his family's tradition of military service, not only as his great-grandfather had, but also as several members of his family still do, serving in the Chicago Police Department. He told his mother that he wanted to pursue his dream and promised her that after it was over, he would finish his degree. Shortly after enlisting, he completed basic training and earned his wings at the Airborne School at Fort Benning, Georgia. He became an automatic rifleman assigned to B Company, 1st Battalion, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment of the storied 82nd Airborne Division. The motto of the 82nd Airborne is "Airborne all the way." Isaiah lived every bit of this motto in his faithful service to America and with his family and friends. He enjoyed wrestling, traveling the world, and cheering for his beloved Chicago White Sox. He was a foodie who loved good soul food, and perhaps more especially, he loved spending time with his younger brother. As a member of his family noted, he was energetic, athletic, funny, humble, all the things you'd want your kid to be. Madam President, every member of the Senate would be proud to have a son like Isaiah, and every member joins me in expressing our condolences to his family at this painful moment and grieving with them over Isaiah's bright light ended all too soon. Madam President, I yield the floor. Suggest the evidence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.